Thank you so much, Brianna. What a great testimony, too. It's kind of fun. We all get to be a herd together, isn't it? Don't have a cow, man. All right. Sorry. Just before we dive into God's Word this morning, I just wanted to take a moment for just a little pastoral chat again that we're kind of doing throughout this month of December. Over the last number of years, our church has pursued a lot of different renovations. We have been going through renos just about constantly for a long time. We've put in new windows, we've done new siding, new paint, new screens, new flooring, new upgrades to the sound, new lighting, all kinds of things. Lots of projects have been undertaken. Years ago, when we completed what we called our refresh project, which was a major renovation because the building was falling into some disrepair, I remember thinking that I never wanted renovations to actually end. Not because I love renovations, but because with an older building, if you don't keep up on it and keep refreshing something all the time, you're eventually going to hit a major project that's going to be a huge amount of work to do. Now, the challenge, of course, with renovations is that they are uncomfortable. If anyone's ever lived through this, we did it in our basement one time, and we had to crawl through boxes to get to the laundry room. It was terrible. It's messy, it's dirty, it's just inconvenient. When we pulled up the old carpet earlier this year, if you were here back then when we did that, and we had the chairs set up 1 week on plywood floors, and it was still dusty and dirty, despite Rob's best efforts to sweep it up. And he, marvelous job, Rob, getting that clean for us. But it's still a mess. And it can be hard in the middle of the mess of renovations to keep your eye focused on the coming goal that you're shooting towards. Now, as much as we've done a number of renovations to the physical building of the church, God has also been renovating us as a people. He has been doing an incredible work forming us. Just like our vision prayer states that we want to pursue God so that he would form us to be Christ-centered, spirit-empowered, mission-focused people. We want God to renovate who we are as a people. People as individuals, so we would look more like Jesus, and people as a whole coming together so that we would reflect his character to the world around us. And that means we're constantly doing renovations on how we do things together as a church. Changing programs and rhythms that better embrace the work of formation that God is doing in us. Which is part of the reason we made the decision that starting in January, we're moving to 2 services. A service at 9 a.m. on Sundays and then 11 a.m. on Sundays. To try and create capacity so that as a church, we can together be formed more like Jesus and also encourage others to do the same and increasingly invite others in our city to encounter his grace. But we recognize that because this is like a renovation, it's going to be dirty, it's going to be messy, it's going to cause some chaos. Even just talking with some people this week, as we announced this last Sunday, and they were talking about which service are we going to go to, and which service are our friends going to go to, and are we going to see them? And how's this all going to work with kids ministry and hospitality and the teams I serve on? All these things that are going to get messy. But as we figure out so many different pieces in this, as we work out the kinks over the coming months, we trust that we'll be able to persevere in the renovations, keeping the completed goal in view. That God is continuing to shape and form us as a people, as individuals, so that we will be a more effective witness of his grace to our city. And I hope that you'll be okay to come along for the ride. In the mess, continuing to look to Jesus to accomplish his good purpose in us. As always, if you have questions or comments about that, we are very open and welcome to hearing what you have to say, and we'd love to hear from you. All right, let's turn our attention to God's word this morning. It's one of those times a year where we start to see lots of things happening in our community. We get to see and hear the Christmas bells ringing. Oftentimes with those who are attending the Salvation Army Christmas kettles around our city. We get to see people looking out for those who are in need, putting together Christmas hampers. This is a time of year when the food bank gets incredibly busy. And from what I understand in the current climate that we're living in these days, even more so, with many, many people who are in need. Christmas is one of those times of year that frequently brings to mind a sense of the inequality that we feel in society. the economic inequality, the social inequality. We see it play out even more than normal at Christmas. Now, of course, this is not actually a new problem. We've been looking through the prophet Isaiah throughout the last couple of months and reading what he had to say into the culture, that as God gave him words to speak into some of the problems that were going on in his day. And even there, we see the same kinds of things, where Isaiah was called by God to go and speak against a lot of these social inequalities, these problems that they were experiencing because of the way people chose to live selfishly rather than giving to one another. And Isaiah was to go and declare judgment on God's people, on the people who oppress them, and on the whole world for the way that we as humans have decided to go away from God's plan for how things should work. But not only did he proclaim judgment, that was sort of the first few weeks. We looked all about the judgment that God was going to declare against people. He also, Isaiah began to declare hope. Because God wasn't going to just leave it with judgment, but wanted to bring restoration in his good creation and with his people. And that's the plan of restoration that we see unfold in the second half of Isaiah's prophecies that are recorded for us in the book of Isaiah. That God would send one person, his sent one, which is the word Messiah, who would come to bring restoration to all things. And that's what we're looking at throughout the month of December, leading up to Christmas, which is appropriate timing for that, because coincidentally, the same person that was prophesied in Isaiah is the one we celebrate at Christmas, which is Jesus Christ. But what was that restoration supposed to look like? How was God intending for the world to be set right? What did that mean? Well, that's what we're going to take a little bit of a peek at today as we dive into Isaiah chapter 42. We're just going to be reading the first part of this. The whole thing is incredible, but we'll read the first part of it together. So let's start with verses 1 to 4. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nation. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his teaching, the islands will put their hope. There's way more in this little text than we're going to touch on today, but we are going to touch on a few things. The most obvious being, did you notice that in these 4 verses, the word justice shows up 3 times? You should have noticed I bolded it for you. That was, mental note there. Okay, mentioned 3 times in 4 verses. Because the servant that God was calling, Jesus, who he would send into the world, was called with the purpose of bringing justice on earth. Now, when you say the word justice, what comes to mind? I mean, typically, I think for me, when I think of the word justice, I think of maybe a judge declaring a verdict on something to correct a wrong that's been done. If there's justice for something, that means the wrongdoer is going to receive some kind of punishment, and the other person will receive some kind of vindication. And that's what justice feels like. But in the biblical sense, the word for justice goes far beyond that. Now, just a little side note, I'm going to break a preaching rule for myself today. One of my preaching rules is I don't like to share what a Greek or Hebrew word is with you, because I just, how many of us actually know Greek or Hebrew? I don't even know it that well. But here's the deal. The Hebrew word for justice is mishpat. Okay? Mishpat. And this is an incredible word as you go digging into the text of Isaiah, into the text of the Old Testament, because you see how many different connotations it actually carries. It's not just the kind of justice we think of a judge proclaiming a verdict on something. It goes far beyond it. And here's how I want to unpack that a little bit. We're going to look a little bit, just remind ourselves of the Exodus story. The Exodus story, when God's people went down into Egypt, they were held up as slaves, and then they were eventually delivered by God to come out of Egypt and go into their own promised land. Because in the Exodus story, there is such a great example of the range of meaning of what justice and injustice are really about. The injustice we see within how we do things as humanity, and the justice that God brings about in a couple of different forms. So, just really briefly, Let's consider Egypt's injustice against Israel. Israel had come down into Egypt as these foreigners, refugees really, who were getting away from a famine in their land. And they had come down to Egypt under Joseph's leadership. Joseph, who ascended to second in command in Egypt, things were going well. But then Joseph died off, that whole generation died off, and the Egyptians forgot who these Israelites were and why they were there. And so acts of injustice started to be perpetrated against the Israelites. And we see it politically. Israel was in Egypt, like I said, as refugees. They were an ethnic minority due to the famine. And they end up facing incredible discrimination by the Egyptians. And they have no political voice. But instead, they're also facing injustice economically because they're forced into slave labor to use the land that they have been given, that was given under the previous Pharaoh when Joseph was still alive. They were given this incredible land to farm and to use. But then this new Pharaoh comes to power, and now they have to use the goodness of that land to serve Egyptian interests only. And they're driven into slave labor. They also faced injustice socially. Because the enslavement doesn't kill them off or get them to decline in numbers. And so ultimately, the Pharaoh decides that he's going to actually institute a state-sponsored genocide of all the kids that were born in Israel. Works of incredible injustice. And while it would be great to say that, this was thousands of years, and in our modern world we've gotten so far beyond these things, can we say that's true? But into this injustice, God came to bring about acts of justice. And there's sort of two kinds that we actually pick up in the biblical text as God speaks about the acts of justice that he will bring. First, God brings retributive justice, ensuring that the Egyptians will pay for their offense against Israel, for all the injustice that they've committed against his people. Notice what it says in Exodus 7:4. When Pharaoh does not listen to you, I will lay my hand upon Egypt and bring my people, the Israelites, company by company, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. Mishpat. Great acts of justice. Now, what were those great acts of justice? Well, those were the plagues that he sent against Egypt. Plague after plague, bringing incredible thick darkness, bringing frogs or locusts or flies, bringing disease, killing off the firstborn son of every household in Egypt. God brought justice against the Egyptians for what they had done to his people. But we also read in the Exodus account that God was bringing restorative justice for his people. Not just retributive justice against Egypt, but restorative justice for Israel. Exodus 6:6. Say therefore to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will free you from the burdens of the Egyptians and will deliver you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. Mishpat, referring really to the same thing, but this was going to bring Israel now out of slavery, out of bondage, and into their own land, where God would set them up to be a people who could flourish in his grace. Now that mode of justice, this restorative justice, rather than being paying something back for an offense, is really more about making sure that everyone in the community is treated fairly and given what they're due. It's about granting people rights by changing unjust laws and practices. And that's what God did. He brought his people into their own land. And he gave them laws that would help them ultimately flourish as a people. That they would live in a way that would show the beauty of what God had given in his creation. And they would be able to enjoy it fully and live in good relationship with one another, where no one was taken advantage of, but everyone was treated fairly and equitably. So when you read through some of the laws that God gave his people, I know we talk about, the Old Testament law seems like such an oppressive thing. I mean, okay, 613 laws is not that many to begin with, but when you look at a lot of the laws, you got to consider what they're about. God told his people not to have differing weights or measures for when they were doing economic transactions. Don't have a set so that you can gouge people so they think they have to pay more for what you're giving them, or have a different set so that things look lighter when you're paying for something so it costs you less. Don't cheat people. They had laws about leaving the edges of their fields unharvested so that the poor and the needy could come after the harvesters had come through and take what was on the edges of the field so they would have enough to eat. Caring for the needs of the poor, social justice. There's all sorts of laws about caring for the foreigner among them. Political justice. In fact, there's 4 groups who are consistently mentioned throughout the laws as those who were kind of in the lower status of society, that God was constantly trying to make sure they were cared for. The poor, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigner. After all, it's not just fair to say that the lower classes of people are more vulnerable to injustice, but they actually experience it to a disproportionate level. And so God's laws of justice were to disproportionately care for the vulnerable, because he knew that they would be the ones facing the most injustice. So within God's good plan for his people, he set things up in his law so that everyone would be cared for and treated fairly and equitably, so they could all flourish in a just society. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, if you've been following along with us, or if you've read the Old Testament of the Bible, you will know what I'm going to tell you next. That didn't go so well. God's people did not walk according to his law. They did not care for people fairly and equitably, but instead, even within their own people, took advantage of one another, placed themselves above other people, demeaned people who were lower than them. Consistently, they did not live according to God's law. And so earlier in the book of Isaiah, right, and we talked about this a few weeks back, earlier in the book of Isaiah, when God was speaking a prophecy against his people, we read a little parable about a vineyard. And the owner who took good care of his vineyard, and he went out to see if he had a harvest of good grapes, and all he found were lousy grapes. And the commentary on it by the owner was basically that the owner went out looking for justice, mishpat, but found only bloodshed, which is a play on words because that word is mishpat. He went out looking for justice, but found only bloodshed among his people. He didn't find people living according to the laws he had set in place, but rather going out to take advantage of others for their own advantage. And so, as a result, well, God chose to judge his people because they had not been living justly, and he sent them off into exile as a punishment. But here's the thing. God's pretty determined when he sets his mind to something. When God has something that he is going to accomplish, then he is going to make sure he gets it done. And it's in God's heart that there would be justice, restorative justice in the world. That there would actually be people able to live, humanity able to live in the thriving life that he intends for us. There's actually an implication, in the fact that God created the world. There's an implied covenant that he will look out for the world's welfare. Don't you think? God created it in the first place, and so he has taken on himself the responsibility that he will care for the welfare of his creation. He wants to make sure this kind of just society is what comes. He wants to make sure that this world is a place of justice. So he then sends his Messiah, his sent one, this servant, to bring justice in the world. Which brings us back. This is our little circle tour. We've come back now to Isaiah and the servant of the Lord. The servant of the Lord that we are told is anointed with the Spirit of the Lord. The one who has the Spirit of the Lord on him, so he will go out empowered by and led by God himself into every space that he needs to go in order to accomplish God's purposes, which is to bring justice in the world. We're told that he's not going to shout or cry out in the street. This is not an oppressive ruler coming to beat people down and tear them apart, but someone who would come gently and lovingly to accomplish God's purposes. The servant, the sent one, will establish justice on earth. And again, that's not just retributive justice, although that is a part of the justice God will bring. He will judge every action, every wrong action, and there will be punishment for those things. But he's also there to bring restorative justice and establish a kingdom where things are done right and there is equity for all, where humans can again flourish on the earth. Now, we read verses 1 to 4 of Isaiah 42. I want to read verses 6 and 7 as well, because Isaiah goes on to describe a little bit more the servant of the Lord. And this is actually a direct now statement from the Lord to the servant. He says, I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness. It's part of God's righteousness, his righteous purpose for the world, that he's calling the servant to establish justice, because God is taking responsibility for his creation. I'll take hold of your hand. I will keep you and make you to be a covenant for the people and a light for the Gentiles, to open the eyes that are blind, to free captives from prison, and to release from the dungeon those who sit in darkness. This one who was going to come would be for both the Jews and the Gentiles, both God's covenant people and also a light to the Gentiles, so that everybody could experience God's justice here on earth. And he was going to come and bring sight to the blind, freedom for the captive. Now, in light of that picture, fast forward the tape a little bit. Wow, that's an old reference. Scan ahead in the stream a little bit. And come to the person of Jesus and see how he actually lives out what God has called the servant to do. And we see this in Jesus' life as he went around performing acts, as he went around teaching and doing things, bringing about God's justice on earth. I mean, think about the actions that Jesus did. He comes and he meets up and brings healing to the sick. He brings recovery of sight to the blind. He brings freedom from slavery to sin to people. Consistently, Jesus, as he's going around and living his life during his 3 years of ministry, is elevating the cause of the vulnerable and the downtrodden. I mean, you don't have to look very far to see who Jesus hung out with. He's hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors, people who are viewed as sinners and untouchable by the people of the society, hanging out with lepers who you're not even supposed to touch. And Jesus would. Touching the unclean and the broken, meeting people who were definitely down on the social ladder and elevating them up by coming and spending time with them. Anyone who was considered less than, the sinners, the foreigners, the sellouts, the unclean, were invited to spend time with Jesus. But it wasn't just in his actions that Jesus was bringing about justice or proclaiming justice. We also see it in his teaching. Jesus came right away, right off the bat, with the gospel, the good news that the kingdom of God has come near to you. Not just the kingdoms of the world where we see all these inequalities and injustices taking place, but the kingdom of God that is being set up. The kingdom of God where everybody is welcomed into right relationship with God and one another and has the opportunity to live in a thriving way. A kingdom where people have been saved and brought into the kingdom by grace, so that really there's no reason or right for someone to elevate themselves above another. Jesus preached about the ethics of this kingdom in his Sermon on the Mount, popularly called, which is found in Matthew 5-7. But in this incredible sermon where he's preaching about the ethics of the kingdom, consistently Jesus is talking about making sure we're not elevating ourselves over another. You know, when you think about, if you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. You're elevating yourself and you're using her as an object in your own mind. That's demeaning someone for your own gratification. If you're, speaking words angrily towards someone and holding them in judgment, you're elevating yourself up and you're demeaning them, saying you're less than, and that's why I get to say these things about you. Jesus is saying, don't do that. All these things, Jesus is bringing people back onto the same level playing field because that's where we are as a people saved by grace. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. So in Jesus' message, he's proclaiming justice and what it means to live together in God's kingdom as a just people. But we also see Jesus bringing justice even in his trial and death. When Jesus faced his trial before Caiaphas the high priest, before Herod the king, or Pontius Pilate the Roman governor, he was staring square into the face of human injustice. Rulers who were more concerned with holding on to power than ensuring that an innocent man would be treated fairly. And in that place, looking at the face of injustice, Jesus took the debt of our sin. He was innocent of it, but he took the debt of our sin on himself. And he paid the price for God's retributive justice for our sin. He faced human injustice, and he took instead God's justice upon himself so that we could be set free. And by his resurrection, he opens up for us the door to the new restored life for anyone who would believe in him and receive his gift of grace for us. Jesus, the one that we celebrate coming into the world at Christmas, is the servant of the Lord who came to bring justice on earth. So what does that mean for us who have chosen to be followers of Jesus? Maybe you're not quite there yet. It's okay. Maybe you've been there for a long time and you've been walking with Jesus for a while. But for those of us who have chosen to follow Jesus, well, there's a pretty simple command actually that this predates when Jesus came into the world, but comes to us from Micah 6:8, another prophet. He has told you, O mortal, what's good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. You know, when I was growing up, the gospel about Jesus, the good news about Jesus that I was taught, was that if I believed in Jesus, I got to go to heaven when I die. And there was sort of the implication that in the meantime, you hang out and wait for that to happen, and maybe tell some other people about Jesus. And that's pretty much it. But can I just say that if that's the gospel you believe, that your gospel is too small? It's not that it's wrong. It's just inadequate. As Jesus' followers, we're not just called to hang around here and just let the world burn until Jesus comes back again. But we're actually called, as Jesus did, to live justly, to do justice in our world. Which means standing up against acts of injustice, standing up against acts that would diminish or demean human flourishing or people's value as image bearers of God himself. It means standing up to economic injustice, standing up against systems or people who would take advantage of others to benefit themselves, maybe charging excessive interest or profiteering. Lots of that's gone on in our culture is a part of what has led to so much housing insecurity for so many people. How do we stand against those things as the body of Christ? Or socially, standing up against injustice where people are demeaning others to elevate their own status. Standing up against people who are choosing to gossip about other people or slander them and say, actually, I don't want any part of hearing about them. I want to seek their good. I don't want to be a part of tearing them down for their bad. It means standing up to political injustice, where maybe we villainize others, who maybe just have other ideas of how to achieve human flourishing than we do. Our world today, it is full. It is so full of opportunities to elevate ourselves and devalue others because of how we think about things or how we look at things. And to only see dignity in people who happen to agree with me. But we're called as Jesus followers to do justice, to stand against systems or people who would perpetuate those kind of patterns in our world. And instead, lean into places where we can bring about human flourishing and goodness. Now listen, I get that the issues that we are facing are incredibly complex. Some of them are so difficult to even start to wrap our head around how can we make a difference in it. But in the past couple of weeks, I've had 3 conversations that have really just highlighted for me again some ways we can step into bringing about justice. I got to sit with Richard and Angie, just getting to know them as they started coming to our church. I didn't tell them I was going to talk about them this morning. That's my bad. Sorry. But they're working hard to bring about hope and life for people who have been trapped in addiction, and wanting to bring them to a place where they can go through recovery and find hope and life again. This past Tuesday, I was at our ministerial meeting, second conversation, and our mayor and 4 of our council members were there, talking about some of the things that are going on in the city. And the question inevitably is always asked about how can the church be involved in being a part of the solution for some of the challenges that we're facing in the city. And I was speaking with one of the counselors after the meeting was done. And there are some of the issues that we're facing that may be too difficult to dive full steam ahead into. There's some real safety concerns and other things that are there. But there's other ways that we can contribute to the safety and security and flourishing of our city. And it was so great to hear from our mayor and council their heart to see that be a part of what they're doing. They want to see that for our city. And I just wonder, even in how we think about things, could we spend more time praying for our leaders and less time tearing them down when we don't like how they spent our money? Maybe they could use an encouragement that we see the hard work they're doing, and we just appreciate an encouragement from it. Third conversation. I was sitting with some key leaders this week, just talking about how do we navigate care for our seniors? How do we make sure that people who generally become unseen are seen and loved, cared for, and some of their practical needs are looked after? Don't always do a great job of that as a church. I don't always do a great job of that as a pastor. But just to hear the heart of these people too, just to want to care well for those who are a little more vulnerable and whose needs often are unseen by our fast-paced world who's so concerned about getting ahead and rising up. There are opportunities, I think, lots of opportunities for us as followers of Jesus to enter into the same work of justice that our Savior was about. It might come in the form of advocacy or direct care or prayer or discipleship, but it even comes in our corporate worship life together. This can be an act of justice because we come together as a people who stand on level ground before the foot of the cross. A people who value one another regardless of your social standing, the amount of money in your bank account, house you live in, anything else. Doesn't matter what culture you're a part of, what country you were born in, we come together and we are equal at the foot of the cross. To love one another and care for one another and value one another and grow together in Jesus. I was thinking about a couple examples of how we do this, how we actually live this out with justice, caring for one another. And just a couple thoughts came to mind. Last week we put out a note about just the year-end giving need and things like that. And one of the things that Rob said that I really appreciate was just the comment that give what you're able. See, this is one of those opportunities where someone who has lots can give more so that someone who has little doesn't need to feel guilty about not being able to give lots. So that together we can accomplish the goal that God set out for us. We participate together and care for one another's needs in that. But we're also a welcoming community to everybody. We try to be a welcoming community to everybody, providing community, care, welcome, regardless of whether you are an immigrant, you've come from recovery, you're a widow or a widower, you have a fixed income. As a senior, you are a single, you are parents struggling to control your kids because they are just going absolutely wild. You are people with a messy history, or maybe even a messy present. Doesn't matter. You are welcome here. Because we want everybody to experience the flourishing that comes in a relationship with Jesus Christ. Now, that all sounds really pretty, folks. But here's the thing. And this is part of what we talked about before I started the message today. Are we willing to sacrifice some of what we're comfortable with so that we can truly be a people of justice? Are we willing to set aside some of what feels clean and neat and tidy and be comfortable in the mess of the renovation that God's doing so that more people will encounter and be able to flourish in the life he has?